The U.S. Congress, which is bracing to debate over voting and election bills on the floor in the coming weeks. Now, you may ask, why is that significant? Only because they will set the landscape for the consequential 2024 presidential election. And will that mean that the Congress will be doing away with ballot drop boxes? While on the one hand, Georgia, Iowa, Florida and Texas have implemented voting security measures, California, New York, Virginia and Washington, on the other hand, have removed barriers. As for the Democrats, they are preparing to introduce proposals that would allow authority to the federal government to determine how states conduct elections. This would further allow Congress to set nationwide voting standards. On the other hand, House Republicans are scheduled to release a proposal that would tighten voting laws. Republicans are doing so to ensure states maintain primary control over elections. Now, the Grand Old Party will soon introduce the American Confidence in Elections Act. It's been called the most conservative bill in over 20 years. This is in contrast to House Democrats' efforts in the last two Congresses, which would have nationalized the election system. As a matter of fact, Republicans have found renewed vigor since former President Donald Trump made baseless claims of fraud after losing the 2020 election. And such claims will now see ballot drop boxes being done away with, along with greater push for mail-in ballots. So why can't Democrats and Republicans see eye to eye over voting and election laws? And what explains this wide gulf between the Democrats and Republicans? Let's find out. And for that, let me introduce my guests today. I'm joined in by Calvin Dark, who's a Democrat strategist, and I'm also joined in by Corinne Clark, who's a Republican strategist. Thank you so much, Corinne and Calvin, for joining in. Calvin, if I may take my first question from you, why is it damaging to do away with ballot drop boxes? Why not just opt in for mail-in votes?
It's very damaging, and there are two aspects to the ballot drop boxes that I think are important to keep in mind. One is, one of the things that we saw in the last election were some groups, and they were primarily from Trump supporters and Republicans, were standing near or stationed near the drop boxes to intimidate people from voting. So that shows you that that we need to maintain the drop boxes and maintain security around them. The second thing is, drop boxes are necessary to make sure that everybody has access to vote. And I'll give you a personal example. In my home state of North Carolina, where I voted in 2022, I wanted to make sure I could vote early. So I had my absentee ballot, and when I was in North Carolina, I wanted to go and put my vote in a drop box. But guess what? They had restricted the drop boxes to only one location in my county. So even though I'd gotten my ballot, requested on time, even though I made sure that I was ready to put my ballot in a ballot box, the ballot box was 20 miles from my house. So imagine if they restricted them even more.
Right.
So that's why we need to make sure that things like maintaining ballot boxes and maintaining same-day registration, maintaining a wide early voting period, so that more people can vote. I think a key way to think about this, what Democrats are trying to do is making sure that we have more people voting. Republicans' efforts restrict the number of people voting, which I don't think is healthy for democracy.
All right. Corinne, restricting ballot drop boxes, is this jeopardizing democracy or not?
Well, there's absolutely no federal bill proposed currently by Republicans or Democrats that actually limits ballot drop boxes. What the bill released by Republicans this week does is designate a person who has to be responsible for each ballot, so that we don't have what we saw last time, which was called ballot harvesting, where somebody collects God knows how many ballots and they all turn them into the same drop box without any proof that the voter actually authorized the vote that they are handing in. So this bill does not restrict drop boxes or where they are. It only gives people the right to declare a designated person, so that we can keep track of these ballots and know that every vote is being counted. Because with ballot harvesting, you can have people dropping off votes that you didn't authorize, or not dropping off your vote at all. This provides transparency on all sides.
All right, Calvin, Republicans have rolled out a new national voting law in Atlanta. They've also warned Americans to watch out for Democrat deception. We know that Donald Trump inflamed many of those doubts with his insistence that the 2020 election was stolen from him. I want to know from you, why has voter suppression become such a narrative, and why are people falling for it if it is baseless, as is also claimed by the Democrats?
Yes, it's incorrect to say that the real goal is to restore voter confidence in elections, as the Republicans are saying. Their one goal for this legislation, proposed legislation, is to continue to feed this false allegation from former President Trump and his supporters that the 2020 election was stolen. There are not any problems that are at the level to really take away from the integrity of our elections. But as we approach 2024, Republicans feel they need to, feed this narrative. One thing I like to remind folks when they wonder, well, maybe we need to tighten some things up in our election system. When former President Trump said, for example, in Georgia, how there was so much corruption and that's why he lost the state, he didn't mention the fact that the Republican governor won and beat the Democratic challenger. So if the election was rigged, how can you only rig part of the ballot? So I think we just need to make sure we see through all of those. And the second thing that we need to remember is that this legislation has zero chance of becoming law before 2024. One reason is, even if Republicans could get together and pass it in the House of Representatives, it would not pass the Senate. And even if by chance it passed the Senate, it would not pass with Joe Biden's signature. So this is meant to send a signal to members of the Republican base who want to see Republicans feeding into the allegation that the 2020 election was stolen.
All right, Corinne, how do you weigh in on what Calvin just said? Till when will Republicans ride on the fear of voter suppression, when, as Calvin also mentioned, you have a state like Georgia that debunked that narrative?
Well, first, I would like to correct the record that Georgia did not debunk that narrative at all. Brian Kemp won his election in 2022. Trump said that there were issues with Georgia in the 2020 election. In 2021, Georgia passed election integrity laws that protected Georgia a lot in the upcoming election.
No,
Brian
are you
Kemp
also
and
talking
Donald
about
Trump were
midterms?
not on the same ticket.
Are you also talking about this references to the midterms?
Yes, Brian Kemp won a midterm election. Donald Trump lost a presidential election in 2 different years. And in between that time, an election integrity bill was passed in Georgia. So I think if you're saying it debunks the narrative, you're actually making a false point there, because election integrity secured the election for Brian Kemp in 2022. So really, this bill in the House aims to give states the proper information so they can also pass their own election integrity bills so they can have secure elections like Georgia.
Calvin, is such deep partisanship over voting and election law going to impact the upcoming presidential election or create more challenges for the American voter?
Well, from a practical, technical standpoint, these proposed changes won't have any real effect on the election in 2024. Now, there are some states that are pursuing their own voting laws that may try to restrict voting. And then if they do, they will probably end up in the courts. But apart from the technical, logistical effects of these proposed reforms, it really, unfortunately, puts a political cloud over our elections process. Like, one of the things that I think is just really, really amazing about our election system is, if you look before former President Trump, who would, every time he lost an election, it was rigged, but when he won, they were fine. I remember working with elections officials, and you had, for example, volunteers who weren't particularly Democrat or Republican. Some were independent, some weren't really that political. They were just helping in their community to make sure that people could get to the polls and that the votes were counted accurately. And it wasn't a political thing. But these reforms that are being put forward and these debates that we're having in Congress between our two parties lessen the confidence that people have in elections, because now they're viewing the election system itself as being politically arranged, organized, and reformed. So I think that is unfortunate if that continues.
I'd like to end with your thoughts, also give you an opportunity to not just share your closing thoughts, but also give a rebuttal to perhaps what Calvin has just had to say.
Yeah, I'm disappointed a little bit that Calvin does not want to talk about the specifics of this bill that's being introduced by Republicans in the House. And I think the reason that he doesn't want to do that is because this bill does not intend to standardize elections or increase federal overreach and local elections. What it does is provide transparency. It requires that the Social Security Administration reports to states to tell them when voters have died so they can remove them from ballot rolls. It increases election finance transparency so we can see which PACs are donating to which candidates and where the money is going. That is good for everybody. And the other thing it does is increase transparency when outside groups fund local election boards, like we saw in 2020, when Mark Zuckerberg dumped millions of dollars into the election boards of local states and swing counties. So that is just an increase in transparency. This does not close down ballot boxes. It does not do anything except increase the transparency, which will hopefully improve everyone's confidence in our elections.
Right. Oh, well, we'll have to wait and watch.
We're avoiding the specifics.
Right. We'll have to wait and watch, because remember, these bills are still to be argued on the House as far as the U.S. Congress is concerned. I'm sure much will emerge in the next few days, and we'll have to wait and watch what the outcome is like. On that note, I'd like to thank you, Corinne and Calvin, for joining in.